Archiving started.
Hello, this is Dr. Laist. Last week, we talked about moving from summary to analysis. This week, I'd like to talk about literary analysis in a little more detail. The literal meaning of analysis is to break something down into its component parts. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the component parts of fictional texts. Works of fiction are a lot like real life in certain ways. In real life, time is always moving forward, we are always a human being surrounded by other human beings, and we are always in some particular place. Time, people, and place. When we are writing about fictional narratives, we call these things plot, characters, and setting. In a story, as in life, time is always passing and events are always unfolding. A major difference about fictional stories, however, is that they have a beginning and an ending. In life, there are no real beginnings and endings. We live in an infinite flux of past causes and future effects. But a story writer always has to choose a place to begin the story and a place to end it. Aristotle said something that sounds kind of obvious, but which is really rather profound. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. When thinking about literature, it is helpful to think of a story in terms of its beginning, middle, and end. An obvious place to begin the story of The Wizard of Oz would have been when Dorothy first arrived in Oz, but instead, the story begins when she is still in Kansas. One of the reasons the story begins when it does is that it gives the writer a chance to introduce the character of Dorothy so that we know what kind of person she is before she gets launched into space. This is known as exposition, laying out the background information that the story needs to establish before it really gets started. Asking questions about the exposition can help you identify what the author wants to direct your attention toward. For instance, in the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and Miss Gulch are having a conflict about Toto. The writer seems to be misleading us into thinking that this movie will be all about a girl who tries to protect her dog. Of course, the movie takes an unexpected turn when Dorothy is transported to Oz, and Toto's freedom is no longer an issue. So the question becomes, why does the story start off with this conflict? What is the relationship between Dorothy's loyalty toward her dog and her adventures beyond the rainbow? Once the characters are introduced, most stories will introduce some kind of conflict, which it will be the business of the story to resolve. For Dorothy, very clearly, she needs to return to Kansas. The need to accomplish this goal and to resolve the conflict of her displacement is her primary motivation throughout the story. It is in order to return home that she must follow the Yellow Brick Road, find the Wizard of Oz, and obey his command to kill the Wicked Witch of the West. But although this goal opens up the middle of the story and determines the actions that Dorothy needs to accomplish, an important aspect of the middle of Dorothy's story is that she becomes motivated by other values along the way, particularly the friendships she discovers with the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. The middle of a story is often divided between the elements of the narrative that drive the story forward and the elements of the narrative that don't necessarily drive the story forward, but which give the story its texture and life. We can always ask about the middle of stories, how plot-driven is the story? What is the relationship between the main action of the plot and any detours or sideshows we come across along the way? How would Dorothy's story be different if she hadn't stopped to talk to the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, and instead accomplished her primary objective all by herself? Of course, the ending of a story is usually where we expect to find the moral, as in an Aesop fable. The Wizard of Oz provides a very clear moral: there's no place like home. And that would seem to be the end of it. But stories are usually more complicated than the morals they suggest, and in The Wizard of Oz, although the value of Dorothy's Kansas home is affirmed, she would never have been able to appreciate the value of home if she hadn't gone away, so going away must be important as well. When we perceive a moral emerging from a work of literature, it's always a good idea to question whether the moral is really a perfect reflection of what the story is actually demonstrated. Of course, most stories do not have an explicitly stated moral at the end of them, but stories tend to end either happily or tragically. If a story ends happily, like The Wizard of Oz, then the moral is that you should be like the characters in the story so that you can live happily ever after too. If the story ends tragically, like Romeo and Juliet, then the moral might be that you should not act like the characters in the story. Some stories leave us up in the air, with no clear impression of either happiness or tragedy, in which case any number of morals might be conceived and argued for. Kate Chopin's short story, The Storm, which you will read next week, is one such story. Characters can be divided into categories as either good guys or bad guys, or as flat or round characters. The good guy is known as the protagonist, and is usually the main character. In The Wizard of Oz, our protagonist is obviously Dorothy. We root for her and want her to succeed, not only because she seems like a kind, principled, and likable person, but also because we see the whole story from her perspective. We ride along on her shoulder throughout the movie, sharing her experiences and identifying with her. When we see a protagonist in a movie, we can ask questions like, what makes her good? What makes us like her? Many stories also have a bad guy or antagonist who exists for the purpose of trying to thwart the protagonist. The Wizard of Oz once again provides a very clear example in The Wicked Witch of the West. Some stories, however, may dramatize a more subtle kind of conflict. In the story of Jack and Jill, the antagonist would seem to be the hill. Some characters might even be their own antagonist, characters in conflict with themselves. In movies like Scarface, Goodfellas, or American Psycho, the main character with whom we identify might also turn out to be the bad guy, causing us to question very closely what makes a character or a person good or bad. One of my favorite ways of characterizing fictional characters is to consider them as either flat or round characters. Flat characters are characters who are one-dimensional and cartoonish. They lack interiority and depth. They are stereotypes, incapable of change or self-understanding. The goofy neighbor on a situation comedy, the dumb blonde, the game show host. In a way, all of the characters in The Wizard of Oz are flat characters. The Cowardly Lion can always be counted on to be cowardly. The Wicked Witch can always be counted on to be wicked. These are characters who are locked into a certain role. The opposite of the flat character is the round character, a character who is capable of change and self-understanding, a character who seems to have an inner life and who is capable of surprising us by doing something unexpected. The round character, that is to say, is recognizable as a human being, possessing her own free will, unlike the flat character, who is always inseparable from their role. From another perspective, although the Cowardly Lion is frequently cowardly, he does occasionally act courageously, as when he is helping to rescue Dorothy from the witch's castle. At the end of the movie, the Wizard of Oz explains that the lion was never really cowardly. He had the potential for courage in his heart all along. He really was a round character, even if he didn't realize it. Asking about whether a character is round or flat can be a useful technique for examining the character's personality and behavior. Finally, like human life, stories always take place in some kind of place and time. What is important about these aspects of a story's setting for a literary analysis, however, is not just identifying where and when a story is taking place, but also considering the influence of the setting on the story. Why is Dorothy's story set in Kansas? How would the story be different if Dorothy was from New York City? By asking these questions, it becomes clear that the rural and agricultural aspects of Dorothy's home are important aspects in defining the kind of home that there's no place like. Of course, in addition to examining the place itself, we can look at how the place is described. Because it is filmed in a dull sepia tone, Dorothy's Kansas is initially represented as drab and visually uninteresting. When she learns to appreciate the true meaning of home, the audience may also take away the message that they should not judge a place by its appearance. Just because a place looks drab and dreary, that doesn't mean that it can't be full of love. Although the book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in the year 1900, the movie was released in 1939, and the appearance of Dorothy's Kansas is reminiscent of the Dust Bowl conditions of the Midwest in the 1930s. When you consider that farmers were fleeing the plain states in great numbers during this time due to the drought conditions, Dorothy's story of emigration and return takes on a political message about the value of staying put in the homeland. It is also interesting to note that 1939 is the year that World War II broke out. In this context, Dorothy's resistance to the fascist tyranny of the Wicked Witch can be interpreted as an allegory about the imminent conflict involving young people from the heartland of the United States who would soon be swept up by strange new technologies into a distant land to wage a fantastic conflict against the forces of evil. Time, people, and place. These elements of narrative constitute the basic building blocks of literary analysis. Thinking about works of fiction in terms of these basic elements provides a starting point for the more abstract elements of themes and symbolism that we will go on to talk about next week.